After years, brutal years of marching, starvation, and battle, the armies of the First Crusade finally stood at the gates of their ultimate prize, the holy city of Jerusalem. What followed was one of the most famous and infamous sieges in all of history, a final, shocking battle that would literally shape the world for centuries. So let's get into it and figure out how it all went down.
Yeah, that's a quote that really hits you. Our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. That comes from an eyewitness, Fulcher of Chartres. So this is not a story for the faint of heart. It paints this incredibly brutal picture of the city's fall. It was a victory, for sure, but it came at a terrifying cost. To really get what happened, we have to look past the bloodshed and dig into all the complex reasons it was even possible.
And that right there is the central question for us today. I mean, think about it. By the time they got to Jerusalem, the Crusader army was just a shadow of what it once was. They were exhausted, they were outnumbered, they were running out of supplies, and they were staring down one of the best defended cities on the planet. So how on earth did they pull it off? All right, to figure that out, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at just how impossible the siege seemed. Then, we'll dive into 4 key factors historians always talk about: Crusader leadership, the disunity among the Muslim forces, some totally unexpected help, and of course, the raw power of religious faith. And finally, we'll see how it all came together in that last bloody assault.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Imagine you're a crusader arriving in June of 1099. The situation looked, well, hopeless. Absolutely hopeless. The city's governor, a guy named Iftikhar al-Dawla, he had been preparing, and he was ready for them.
And when I say prepared, I mean prepared. You're not just looking at massive walls. We're talking 15 meters high, 3 meters thick. That's a serious obstacle. But the governor, al-Dawla, was smart. He waged a war of attrition before the first sword was even drawn. He had all the wells in the area poisoned. Think about that, no water, in the middle of a blazing summer. And crucially, he had every tree in the surrounding area chopped down. Why? No wood means no siege engines. No siege engines means no way to take the city. It was a brilliant defensive strategy.
And then you have the numbers problem, which was a big problem. After that long, brutal march across Anatolia and the nightmare siege of Antioch, the Crusader army was just decimated. You started with maybe 60,000 fighting men. By the time you get to Jerusalem, you're down to about 12,000. And you're supposed to take on a garrison that's estimated to be 5 times your size. The odds were just staggering. This desperation, it led them to do something kind of foolish. On June 13th, they just threw themselves at the walls in a hasty attack. It was a complete and utter disaster. They had like one ladder. One. Of course, they were easily beaten back. And that failure just confirmed their worst fears. Without the right equipment and a real plan, this city was never, ever gonna fall. So, given all that, how did they possibly turn it around? Well, our first factor is leadership. Now, the Crusade was famous for its leaders bickering and fighting, but here at Jerusalem we see these flashes of tactical genius that really changed the game. And maybe the best example of this comes from Godfrey of Bouillon. He noticed something. The defenders were focusing all their energy on his siege tower, which was right out in the open. So, on the night of July 13th, he makes this incredible gamble. He orders his men to take the entire tower apart, piece by piece, move it nearly a mile in the dead of night, and then rebuild it next to a weaker, less defended part of the wall. Can you imagine the surprise of the defenders when the sun came up? Suddenly, the main threat is somewhere they never expected. But, for every brilliant move like Godfrey's, you have to remember the other side of the coin. The Crusader leadership was messy, to put it mildly. Throughout the entire campaign, personal ambition was a huge problem. You had guys like Bohemond who just wanted to carve out a kingdom for himself back at Antioch. You had important leaders like Stephen of Blois who straight up deserted because they thought it was a lost cause. So, yeah, leadership was a factor, but it was a deeply flawed, complicated one. And this leads us to our second factor, which, you could argue, is one of the most important of all: the political situation inside Jerusalem. See, the Crusaders weren't attacking some unified, powerful empire. They were walking into a city that was caught right in the middle of a rivalry. So here's the deal. The city was basically caught between the Seljuk Turks, who had controlled the area for a long time, and the Fatimids from Egypt. And the key thing is, the Fatimids had kicked the Seljuks out of Jerusalem just 1 year before the Crusaders showed up. This was huge for 2 reasons. First, it meant Fatimid control was super new and not really locked down yet. But more importantly, it meant the Seljuks up north had zero reason to help their Fatimid rivals.
The Crusaders basically stumbled into a political civil war at the perfect moment. And don't just take my word for it. This wasn't some Western fantasy. The 13th century Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir said it plain as day. He wrote that the discord between the Muslim princes is what enabled the Franks to overrun the country. He's basically saying, we were fighting each other, and that's why they won. The Crusaders got incredibly lucky with their timing. Okay, so even with some clever tactics and a divided enemy, the Crusaders still had that one massive problem we talked about. No wood. No wood, no siege towers. No siege towers, no victory. This is where our third factor comes in. A moment of what must have felt like a literal miracle. Right when things looked bleakest, on June 17th, a small fleet of ships from Genoa, Italy shows up on the coast. But they're immediately trapped by the Fatimid navy. So what do? They make this insane decision. They take their own ships apart, and they haul all the timber, the ropes, the tools, everything, overland all the way to Jerusalem. All of a sudden, the Crusaders didn't just have the wood they so desperately needed, they had expert Italian engineers to build the war machines. This was the game changer. Without the Genoese, the siege probably fails. So now they've got the tactics, a divided enemy, and the tools they need. But remember, these are men who are starving, they're thirsty, they're exhausted, and they're about to launch a frontal assault on a fortress. This brings us to our fourth and final factor, the unbelievable and honestly terrifying power of religious zeal. To get the army over that final psychological hurdle, the leaders turned to their faith. They organized this huge, barefoot procession around the city. Imagine that, the entire army marching around the very walls they're about to attack, led by priests chanting psalms. This was pure psychological warfare, but aimed at their own troops. It was about unifying the army and convincing every single soldier that God was on their side for the final push. And then, right in the middle of the final assault, when things were starting to look bad, this thing happens. The chronicler Raymond d'Aguirre swears he saw a mysterious knight appear on the nearby Mount of Olives, waving his shield, urging them on. Was it real? Was it a mass hallucination from heat and exhaustion? Honestly, it doesn't matter. The sight absolutely electrified the Crusaders. It was the sign they were waiting for, and it gave them that last burst of energy they needed. But was faith the only thing driving them? I mean, it was clearly a massive motivator, but historians like Thomas Asbridge have a more nuanced view. He points out that in other battles, like at Antioch, the big turn to God happened only after every other military option had failed. It was almost a last resort. And we can't forget the more worldly motivations. The promise of grabbing land and getting rich was a huge driver for a lot of these guys. So the real motivation was probably a complex mix of piety and personal gain. Okay, so let's put it all together. You've got Godfrey's tower, moved in secret. You've got the Genoese timber, now built into a massive weapon. And you have an army absolutely pumped up on religious fervor. The final assault kicks off on July 14th. The battle raged for 2 full days. It was brutal. Finally, on July 15th, Godfrey's siege tower, the one he moved to that weaker spot on the wall, it gets close enough. They drop the drawbridge, a few knights scramble across, and that's it. The wall is breached. The city is about to fall. And from the Crusader point of view, what happened next was God's will. The same priest who saw the night on the mountain, Raymond d'Aguirre, he didn't see the slaughter as a tragedy. He wrote that it was a just and splendid judgment of God. This was the holy, righteous end to their long pilgrimage. But from the other side of those walls, the story is one of unimaginable horror. Ibn al-Athir writes about a massacre on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. He says over 70,000 people were killed in the Al-Aqsa Mosque alone. Scholars, religious leaders, civilians who were just seeking sanctuary. It's 2 completely different realities describing the exact same event. Which brings us to our final question, really. How do you explain the fall of Jerusalem? Was it divine will? Was it a stroke of brilliant military strategy? Was it just incredible political luck? Or was it the result of a brutal, violent fanaticism? The truth is, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect, deadly storm of all of them coming together. Tactical genius, a divided enemy, a lucky break with allies, and a religious belief so powerful it drove men to acts of both incredible bravery and unspeakable cruelty. The real challenge for us, looking back, is trying to figure out which of those mattered most.